r/AskReddit. As a kid, what was the creepiest, most WTF thing you ever noticed about another kid's family? A classmate of mine's family vanished, if that counts. When I was 10, in the mid 1970s, my family and I lived in a rural area where farming and logging were collapsing. My family were old stock in the area, but a culture that was 100 years old was coming to an end. People were leaving in droves. This meant there was a lot of cheap housing available but no work. The housing situation attracted what could be best described as rural crust punks in droves, before crust punk really existed. Locals called them wild dogs because they were dangerous, scavenged and moved in large packs. My school was 2/3 students that came from wild dog families. My parents were very open-minded and got along well with them. Most of the district shunned the wild dogs. Winter that year, my maternal aunt died in a car accident. She lived 300 miles away. My mother was distraught. She left immediately to help my uncle. My father stayed, but booked a flight for the next Friday at 7 p.m. and then began looking for someone to take care of me. No one was available. He was getting desperate and mentioned it when he came to pick me up from school Friday afternoon. A woman named Beth volunteered. Beth had a daughter, Anella, in my class. My father jumped at the offer, actually left me there and then. I did not even have any clothes. He just handed our house keys over to Beth. Beth was one of the wild dogs. Anella always came to school dirty, with torn clothes. I barely knew her. I think my father presumed we were friends, because we were in the same class. In fact, I did not even know where she lived. After my father left, we got in the car. My stomach roils. I try to contain the tears which are coming. I tell myself that we could not be far from Anella's home. I can hold off the crying till and then hide in her bathroom. But when Beth drove away, the car went the wrong direction. We drove down the valley, then up into the mountains and way back into farmland about 20 miles from the school. I started to panic. Beth was reassured me. We are just staying at a friend's place at the moment. I saw a fleeting moment of confusion on Anella's face. After she said that, we turn off the main road and drive up a narrower dirt road, finally parking in front of an ancient shack. The paint was flaking, lichen growing on the wood, the roof rusted brick red. The wraparound porch sagged violently on one side. It was situated in the edge of an overgrowth field. Beside the shack was dense forest. There were at least a dozen cars around the house, some wrecks, one actually burnt out. 20 people at least lounged on the porch smoking, chatting, drinking tea. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. I was shivering, underdressed for an evening in the mountains. Inside the house was smoke stained, but warm and filled with even more people than outside. Every room had sleeping bags placed in on every inch of floor space. I asked Anella if this was a party. She looked surprised at the question. The first night, people just kept arriving. The noise and movement helped me forget my anxiety. A man was playing guitar. Most of the adults were drinking heavily, loud and occasionally fighting. A man passed out in front of me and then urinated on himself. When it all died down, around 3 a.m., Anella and I went to bed. When we woke around noon, people were still sleeping everywhere. Beth made us bacon and eggs. She said she would drive me to my home on Monday and get me some clean clothes. After breakfast, she gave me some of Anella's things to wear. They were too large on me and smelled. Saturday was fun. We played with Anella's dog and a bunch of other wild dog children who had arrived during the previous night. Saturday night was a carbon copy of the night before. Around midnight, I started to nod. Beth put Anella and I to bed, together, in her bed. Despite the raucous gathering, we dropped off right away. My next memory is of waking suddenly. I do not know how long I was asleep. The house was cold and dark and very quiet. There was a flash of light. Anella woke too. We were both confused. Anella called out to Beth. Nothing. Called again. Same result. Despite the cold and dark, we decided to get up. We just got our feet on the floor and bang. It came outside the house, right on the wall at the head of the bed. Bang, on the other wall. We screamed, ran out into the hall. We are both calling to Beth by then. Still no reply. Bang, this time near the front door. We ran from room to room. The house was completely empty. There were bottles of beer on the floor, just opened. The fire had gone out. We looked at a clock. It was 2:48 am. Anella and I started to bawl. Unable to think of what we should do, we went back to bed and hid under the covers till the sun came up. Dawn did not improve the situation. The house was still empty. Being pretty remote, there was not a phone. I was very afraid at this juncture. Anella was terrified. We both did it. Anella wanted to stay put. Maybe her mum would come back. I had a really bad feeling and wanted to go to the neighbors. We eventually decided to wait till midday, and if she had not returned, we would walk to the neighbors, who were about a mile away. Midday came and went. We left for the neighbors. Outside, there were a lot of tire tracks. The cars were all gone, except the burned out wreck. We ended up only having to walk about 800 yards before we met a farmer fixing his fence. He drove us to a general store, which was where the nearest phone was located, and called the police. The police came and asked us questions, then went out to the house to investigate. Between when we left and 5 p.m, when they arrived at the shack, the house was cleared. No furniture, no garbage, not even soot in the fireplace. My parents flew back immediately. I was so glad to see them, I cried. It was a year before I was happy to be separated from them again. What followed was the unveiling of a complex mystery. It quickly became apparent that Beth was using a false name. They could not find any record of Anella's birth. Anella did not know where she was born, but said her mother told her she was born on a communal farm called Bredlow. No property with this name was located. She did not know the names of any aunts or uncles, grandparents, or even her father. All the adults she knew were at that house that night. Anella had not even known they were squatting. No one in the area had even known that wild dogs were living in that house. Members of other wild dog groups were interviewed. The groups did not intersect much, so rarely knew much about the others. They found out nothing new. The police asked Anella and I all kinds of questions, but we could not add anything. We slept through whatever happened. Anella stayed with us till it was determined no relatives could be found, and she went into foster care, after which point I never heard from her again. I have looked for her on Facebook with no success. Media coverage scant, because the police declared it a child abandonment case and they were trying to protect Anella's identity. This did nothing to stop the gossip. The bizarre nature of the story led to Anella and I being labeled liars. Anella got away, but the label stuck with me till I left to go to college. Since I reached adulthood, I check in on the mystery every few years. In the decades since, no trace of Beth or the partygoers have ever been found. In fact, not even a single fresh clue, nor did the authorities ever positively identify any one of the missing, Beth included. When I was in middle school, one of the girls from my scout troop ended up coming over for dinner one night. I didn't really like this girl much. She was really handsy and did things that were inappropriate that made me feel uneasy. But my mom taught me to be nice to everyone, and she'd never actually done anything directly to me. I'm pretty sure this whole playdate was forced though, because I remember my stomach feeling sick when I knew she'd be joining us at dinner. At this point there was just something about her that spooked my little middle school self and made me really nervous. And to make matters worse, it was August in NJ during hurricane season, so this girl comes over for dinner and ends up getting stuck at my house for a couple days because of a storm. So I spend a weekend with this kid, and we are at the age where it's still sorta acceptable to take naked showers with your peers. I took showers with a lot of my friends / cousins / other Girl Scouts, which was never weird, but this girl gave off a really weird vibe that made me not want to bathe with her. In fact, I hated even being out of my parents' sight with her. After a shower we lay down and start watching TV. The Titanic was on, so we decided to just go with that for the evening. I had seen it before and actually liked this movie. I knew it was a long one, so I was hopeful we could watch it and she'd fall asleep first, so I could sneak off and go be with my mom again. Well, she didn't fall asleep, and when the car sex scene comes on she turns to me and tries to get on top of me. She then forcefully tells me to imitate the car scene with her, and that if I tell anyone about it she will lie and say it was my idea. Luckily, I had enough sense to shove her off me and mostly ignore her for the rest of the weekend. I told my mom I never want her to come over again, but I never told her why, because I didn't want anyone to get in trouble. Years later, still in Scouts, but a bit older I realized she must have been molested or even worse. It would explain her over-sexualized behavior and her acting and speaking about things that were inappropriate so often. The words she used to threaten me into keeping her actions a secret also mimic what an adult or person of power would say to the one they are trying to groom. When I got even older there actually were rumors about the whole family being products of incest, plus allegations of her mom, my scout leader, acting inappropriately with kids from the troop. I knew a girl on my swim team whose dad was a huge religion nut. He supposedly wouldn't let her wear shorts that were shorter than knee length, even over her swimsuit, which obviously was a tight-fitting Speedo. She couldn't date. She was homeschooled until high school. One time I went over to her house for a sleepover, and he woke everyone, including me, up at 7 AM for an in-home church service that lasted something like 45 minutes. In retrospect, though at the time I still had uneasy feelings, it was pretty obvious that the dad was probably abusive and had some pretty sexist attitudes. He made my friend clean up after her younger brother, who was probably 8 to 9 years old and should have been doing it himself by that age. He constantly made jokes to my friend about how she was stupid or lazy. He frequently let her do things only to rescind his promises. All of the kids hated each other. I was stunned to go to their house and see them openly calling each other awful or annoying. My friend not only complained about her father, behind his back and understandably so, but was awful and took advantage of her mother, who was a timid woman who let all of her kids yell at her and call her stupid and complain when she didn't get something done. This woman had absolutely no backbone whatsoever. In retrospect I would be willing to bet a lot that her dad turned them all against each other so that they couldn't unite against him. Their house was an absolute disaster. I never used the bathroom when I was over there because it smelled horrible and frequently clogged. They had ant infestations and nail polish stains all over the carpet. They ended up getting a dog at some point, much to my disgust, a fucking German Shepherd in an apartment that the dad wanted for protection. They had to give it away because obviously they didn't take care of it. The dad was probably one of the worst people I've ever met. In retrospect, he was always extremely friendly when I talked to him, but there was a really bad vibe there. My friend told me that he used to hit her with a belt. He lied to her constantly. She was convinced that colleges hacked into your Facebook accounts and read your messages when you were applying. Typing it all out now sounds absolutely bonkers. At the time it was just something we all joked about together, but in retrospect it was some pretty awful abuse. I hope she's doing okay now. I know I'm probably way too late for this, but I remembered this while reading the comments. I was friends with this girl in 5th grade. We'll call her Ali. She was a more punk kid. She sometimes wore eyeliner, and she had pierced her own ears/lip/tongue. I remember her talking about wanting to split her tongue. I would watch her stick pins all the way through her skin and I would follow, but I never broke the skin. She would go all the way in. But I was just starting to get into more punk music, so I sorta envied her style. I remember going to her house for a sleepover with another friend, and while we were there we played a couple of weird games. We tried hypnosis, and when she was trying to hypnotize both of us, she tried to get us to kiss each other. We meddled with witchcraft and tried spells to summon spirits. We melted wax onto our hands. Towards the end of the night we stole some Mike's Hard Lemonade from her dad's stash in the garage and went to the school playground and drank them. I remember at some point during this night she told me and our other friend that her dad hit her. She didn't really sound like she was joking, but she said it so casually, it almost sounded like she was bragging to me at the time. I didn't know if I believed her, so I listened, but didn't say much. A while later I was home alone and decided I wanted to hang out with someone. I usually would contact my friends on my mom's cell phone before going over there, but I didn't have the opportunity to do that. I wasn't even sure who I wanted to see or who would even be able to hang out, so I walked to Alla's house since I figured she probably could. I get there and her mom, and her dad were all sitting on the porch. I felt awkward, but I smiled and said hi. No one smiled. Everyone just stared at me. Ali was staring at me, and I could feel that she was upset. She almost seemed angry. So after a few seconds of standing there awkwardly trying to figure out what the fuck is going on, her mom, who has been staring at me the whole time, says, "Lucky toaster, have you ever seen Ali's dad hit her?" I froze. I didn't know what to say. I didn't take my eyes off Ali. I was trying to read her face to see what I should say. I knew Ali had told me her dad would hit her, but I had actually never seen it. I had heard her dad's angry outbursts from time to time, but had never seen him get violent. I realized that if I said I had, I would have to make up a story in order to support her. If I said she had told me he did, I was risking Ali getting in more trouble than she was already apparently in. So after a while I finally muttered out a no. I never broke eye contact with Ali. Her mom said okay and looked at Ali. I can't remember if she told me to leave or if I left on my own, but I walked away almost immediately after. When I was younger, I always thought maybe Ali had lied and she was in trouble for it. I guess I didn't want to imagine that actually happening. I never told anybody. When I look back, I realize she probably was being abused, and I probably made it worse. I felt guilt for a while after that. I never talked to her again after I left elementary school. I have no idea how she's doing. Went to a friend's house once for a sleepover the night before his dad, our scout leader, gave me and 2 other friends a lift to a weekend camping trip with other regional scout groups. His dad always came off as a scary type of guy, kinda looked like a biker, and had divorced from my friend's mom who apparently gave up, or had my friend's siblings taken away by child services. Not really sure. My friend was understandably always vague. Anyway, it started to get weird when we were in our friend's room and he started showing us his dad's old computer that he gave him with all these porn memes, I guess you could call them, which were photos of girls walking over city air vents with no underwear on in skirts with generally some kind of funny text, and then there was just folders of blatant pornographic photos of women and etc. that he said his dad just left on the computer, and I believe him cause the computer didn't have internet access. His dad also left on the computer all these porno games where you would follow keyboard instructions to fuck women and different ones with animals, which I found pretty uncomfortable as kid, but the friend just saw it as normal for it to be on there. Then later that night we decided to watch a movie and the dad said we could pick a DVD from his room downstairs. When we went down there, the room was packed full of all this BDSM theme models / action figures like dolls of women in leather suits inside miniature cages and stuff, and there was one life-size cage in corner of the room as well. All of this made me feel super uncomfortable, and I didn't really understand why he let us in his room, but we chose the movie Avatar from his massive DVD collection on the wall, which I now realize probably consisted of a lot of porn, but was too naive as a kid to realize. And then from there the rest of the weekend was a pretty normal experience. A few years later the dad ended up giving up the friend and he ended up living with another guy I knew he was good friends with until he left to live at his own place at 16. I've ran into him a few times after scouts growing up, and he's actually a really nice, hard-working guy, I think. Partly because of his shitty upbringing making him work for a living from a young age. Oh, also, my best friend in high school. It's long, but there's a TL doctor at the end if you want. She lived with her mom and would visit her dad in Florida once or twice a year. Whenever she went down there, she'd insist on somebody coming along, and I always figured it was because teen girls don't really want to just hang out with their dads one-on-one, that she just wanted to turn it into a cool trip with friends. Once we became close, she invited me, and I was thrilled to join her, but as we are traveling, she admits that she spent her childhood with her dad before moving in with her mom, and he used to be a neglectful heroin addict who'd sexually abuse her. She said the last time she went down alone, he tried to touch her again. This was her method of keeping him away. Then she told me how his ex-girlfriend's sons raped her from a very early age. The boy's mother and her father were aware and nobody stopped it. She spent years trying to convince her mom to let her live with her and only managed to move in with her about 2 years prior. I was fucking shocked. I was 15. I wasn't really ready for this kind of information, and now I have to spend a week with a child molester. What the fuck? Once we get down there, I find out this guy basically dated women so he could have a place to stay. He used them to support him. It was such a scumbag operation. He offered us weed as soon as he picked us up from the airport. That would have been rad in teenage me's book had I not known he diddled his own daughter for fucking years. I remember what really got to me, when they'd talk to each other, she'd adopt a very flirtatious demeanor, she'd put on a baby voice, make puppy eyes at him, etc. My friend hated his newest girlfriend. She was perfectly lovely and a gracious host, and it came across as though she was a jealous ex. Creepy. I know now that many sexually abused children have a hard time reconciling the fact this parent they love has abused them. They still want the parent's approval and affection, and she'd been basically trained, since a very young age, that the best way to attain that parent's love was by using sexuality as currency. He'd ingrained it in her mind that acting flirtatious and sexually inappropriate was what he expected from her, and, because she'd been taught that the abuse was dad's own special way of loving you, she was jealous that he had a sexual relationship with another woman, even though she didn't actually want him trying to abuse her anymore. It was so fucked to witness. After that trip, her behavior made a lot more sense. She was in constant sexy mode. She couldn't turn it off. It was as if she couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't expected to trade flirting and sex for male approval. We weren't able to hang out with a group of guys without her accidentally flashing her tits or talking in depth about her masturbation habits. She was obsessed with being the most sexually desirable, so she'd fuck other girls' boyfriends just to make a point to reassure herself that she was the sexiest girl in town. The teen boys loved it, but knowing why she did it really got to me. So depressing. TL. Doctor, best friend in high school admitted her dad molested her and let her stepbrothers rape her as we were traveling down to visit him. Watched her flirt with him and act possessive. Worst vacation ever. My mum has always been really drawn to helpless people. She is very empathetic, and I think she feels like she can help them. They are usually the type of people who act like the world is against them, but it's often their own fault. When I was quite little, maybe 6 or 7, there was this lady who my mum was helping. This was the first time I really realized I didn't want my mum to help toxic people, because they would abuse her kindness. This lady, I'll call her Paula, had twin daughters who were about 1 year old. I later found out that they were actually her grandkids from her 16-year-old daughter who I didn't know existed, but I digress. For some reason, my mum had been given a key to Paula's house, and I think she would often go over to feed the cat/water plants and other things that normal people are capable of doing, but this lady wouldn't do. One day mum took me with her, and Paula have left the 2 babies home alone in their cots. They had dirty nappies and the cot mattress was wet, so their nappies must have been crazy full. I remember my mum crying and changing their nappies, and hugging the screaming babies. This was before cell phones, so mum couldn't call Paula. She called my dad from Paula's home phone and explained what happened. When Paula got home, she saw my mum with the babies and yelled at her for not letting them sleep. I was really scared because I had never seen anyone yell at my mum before, so I started crying. Paula then tried to push me to make me quiet, and my mum pushed her out of the way. I'm so proud of her for that. She left the house and took me home. Sometime after, the police came because Paula had called and said my mum had abused her. Mum told them what happened. My dad told them when my mum called, and I had to tell them that Paula pushed me and that the babies were home alone. My mum wasn't prosecuted because the police also had accounts from neighbors of violence and negligence, and it was obvious my mum hadn't done anything wrong. I don't know what happened to those babies because I never saw Paula again, and mum never went to her house again. It just really opened my eyes that some kids grow up with parents that don't love them. Bonus story, my dad is Indian and my mom is Kiwi. I went to this kid from school's house and they were saying really racist things about my dad. Like how he reeks of curry, how he must have sex with cows, how it's too bad I'm basically a mutt, etc. Their parents just laughed at it. I left in tears, and that was my first experience of racism.